Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Abandoned Carnival Is Waiting for Me. Scary story, published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Mark jolted awake, heart pounding in the pre-dawn stillness. He hadn't been sleeping well for weeks, but tonight was worse. His throat was dry, his skin clammy, and a sharp sense of something off lingered in the air. As he reached for his phone, groaning at the time, 3:12 a.m., he noticed something strange on the nightstand. A yellowed, weathered envelope with his name neatly scrawled across it in cursive. Mark frowned. He lived alone. No one had been in his apartment. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. It was stiff, thick, like parchment, and smelled faintly of something old like dust and forgotten years. As he tore it open, a shiver ran down his spine. Inside was an invitation. You are cordially invited to the grand reopening of Hollowbrook Carnival. Hollowbrook. His heart skipped a beat. Carnival had been shut down for over 2 decades. Mark hadn't thought about that place in years. He had buried those memories deep, locked them away like a bad dream. But now they surged back, unbidden. The laughter, the rides, the bright lights, and then the screams. The cold, paralyzing fear. And Tommy, Mark's best friend. The friend who never made it home that night. His fingers curled around the paper as his chest tightened. He didn't need to be reminded of what happened. He'd spent years trying to forget. After the accident, the carnival had closed its gates forever. No one had spoken about it since. But now, here it was again. An invitation, mocking him, daring him. Mark shook his head, forcing the rising panic back down. It's a prank, he told himself, trying to sound convinced. Someone found out about his past, about Tommy, and was messing with him. It had to be. He tossed the invitation in the trash, burying it beneath yesterday's newspaper. But the restlessness stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling of something creeping in the corners of his mind, something long forgotten and dangerous. The next morning, when he rolled over in bed, there it was again. The envelope, perfectly pristine, lying on his nightstand as if it had never left. He stared at it, dread knotting in his stomach. There would be no peace until he returned to Hollowbrook. The carnival was waiting. Chapter 2. Returning to Hollowbrook. The morning air was thick with humidity as Mark drove down the familiar, winding road toward his childhood town. His old sedan rattled and groaned with every bump in the asphalt, a constant reminder of how much time had passed since he'd left. The windows were down, the air stale, and yet there was a part of him that felt like nothing had changed. The same trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches twisted like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. It had been years since he'd driven down this stretch. Hollowbrook was nothing more than a speck on the map, a place you didn't pass through unless you had no other choice. Mark barely recognized the town anymore. It had decayed in ways that left him wondering how it had ever been anything more than a forgotten ghost town. He passed the old gas station, its sign faded, the glass of the pumps shattered, and remembered how he'd stopped there for sodas and a pack of gum on his way to the carnival. That place used to be the lifeblood of Hollowbrook, at least for a time. Now, it was just another relic of a past that had long since slipped away. The road narrowed, the trees closing in on both sides, and before he knew it, he was at the outskirts of the carnival grounds. Mark slowed his car to a crawl. His stomach churned. The entrance gate loomed ahead, its once proud arch now sagging, rusted metal creaking in the wind. Faded banners flapped listlessly, torn and brittle from years of neglect. The place looked more like a graveyard than a carnival. He could barely remember what it had been like, the vibrant colors, the sounds of laughter and excitement. All of that seemed like a distant dream now, replaced by this decaying reminder of what had been lost. The carousel, where he had spent hours with Tommy all those years ago, sat unmoving in the center of the park. The once bright paint was now chipped and peeling, the horses frozen in mid-gallop. But as Mark approached, he could hear it, a soft, eerie melody, barely audible but unmistakable. A carnival tune, distorted by time, playing from nowhere. Mark felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He remembered running out of here, the panic that had overtaken him. Someone had been watching them, and then they had just vanished. His heart raced as he parked his car by the entrance. He hesitated, staring at the broken gates. The invitation was still in his pocket, the paper wrinkled from being clenched too tightly. He should have turned back. He should have stayed away. But the pull was too strong. His feet were already moving before he could stop them, stepping past the gate and into the grounds. The moment he crossed the threshold, a chill ran through him. Something was watching. From the corner of his eye, he saw an old, cracked teddy bear placed on a bench near the ticket booth. He hadn't seen that toy in years. And yet there it was, exactly where he had left it. Chapter 3: The Unfolding Nightmare. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he walked deeper into the carnival. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, the cracked pavement giving way to tangled weeds, and the occasional rusty metal pole jutting from the earth like a forgotten skeleton. The air was heavy with the smell of must and decay, thick as if the carnival itself was exhaling its last breath. The carousel, now only a distant memory of its former self, creaked in the wind, its faded horses swaying ever so slightly. But it wasn't just the carousel that seemed to stir. Mark had the distinct feeling that the whole place was shifting around him, moving when it shouldn't. He blinked, sure that a ride had just flickered back to life for a brief moment, but when he looked again, it was still. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its giant frame casting long shadows across the ground, but there was something unsettling about the way it moved. The slow, groaning creak of the wheel turning sent a shiver up his spine, yet there were no people, no one else around. Just the unnatural sounds of the place and the occasional whisper of the wind. He stopped, listening. He could have sworn he heard something, an indistinct whisper carried through the air, too soft to make out. His skin prickled with unease, and he turned in a slow circle, feeling eyes on him, though there was no one in sight. A flash of movement caught his attention. A figure, someone in the distance standing near the top of the Ferris wheel. Mark squinted, but when he blinked, the figure was gone. His mind was playing tricks on him. He had to be tired, sleep-deprived, maybe even a little paranoid from the guilt that gnawed at him. But the carnival felt alive, as if it was watching him, as if it had been waiting for him. The sound of laughter echoed faintly from behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. Mark's pulse quickened. Suddenly, images began to flash in his mind, scattered, fragmented memories of that night. The twisted, half-forgotten image of Tommy's pale face as he ran toward the Ferris wheel, the sound of his voice calling out in the darkness. And then the scream, a sound so sharp it still burned his ears, even now, years later. But the details were slipping away from him, fading like mist, and he couldn't grasp them. He stumbled forward, his breath coming faster, his thoughts racing. He had to know what had really happened. His eyes fell on the old funhouse mirror, a towering, cracked glass framed by rotting wood. It had always terrified him as a child, the way it warped his reflection, making him look monstrous. He had vowed never to go near it again, but now something pulled him toward it. Hesitantly, he approached, his reflection growing clearer the closer he got. and then he froze. His reflection wasn't right. It was him, but blood. His clothes were soaked in it, his skin pale and slick. The blood smeared his face like a mask, and his eyes stared back at him with a hollow, accusing gaze. He recoiled, but the reflection didn't move. It stayed, staring at him. Mark wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. His hands shook as he reached out, but the glass felt cold, colder than it should have been. And deep down, he knew that the mirror was showing him something he wasn't ready to see. The carnival was alive, and it was calling. Chapter 4. The Carnival Games Begin. Mark stumbled away from the mirror, his legs shaking beneath him, his breath ragged. The blood-soaked reflection still burned in his mind, like a stain he couldn't scrub away. His hands were trembling, his heart thundering in his chest as he backed away from the glass, trying to shake off the feeling that the carnival itself was watching him, waiting. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of here. But his feet wouldn't move. It was as though the ground had turned to quicksand, pulling him back toward the heart of the carnival. And then he saw it. A small stall, almost hidden in the shadow of the Ferris wheel, caught his attention. It was an old ring-toss booth, its wooden frame sagging, the prizes long forgotten. At the top of the stand, old stuffed animals, their faces torn and stained, hung limply from rusty hooks. But it was what was below them that made his stomach turn. The prizes, if you could call them that, were grotesque. A pale, shriveled teddy bear, its button eyes missing. A mangled doll with one arm ripped off, its smile twisted in an eternal grimace. And then, in the center, a severed hand, its skin leathery and gray, fingers frozen in a twisted grasp, as though still clutching at something it would never let go of. His breath caught in his throat. He turned away, his mind screaming at him to keep walking, but something about the booth was drawing him in. He had to play the game. There was no other choice. Mark reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills, his hands unsteady. The rickety carnival barker, a figure in a tattered suit, grinned at him from behind the booth, his teeth yellowed and crooked. The man's eyes glinted with something far darker than amusement. Step right up, step right up. Let's see if you've got the skills to win a prize. The barker rasped, his voice echoing through the air like it was coming from 1,000 different directions. Mark's stomach churned, but he couldn't resist. He picked up one of the old, frayed rings and tossed it, his aim unsteady. The ring sailed through the air and landed with a sickening thud right on the severed hand. His breath hitched. The hand seemed to twitch under the ring, its fingers curling, as if it were still alive. Mark's stomach lurched, and he stepped back, his mind reeling. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hands trembling. The screen lit up with text messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. His mother, his father, Tommy. All the messages read the same. Come back. We've been waiting. His skin went cold. He looked up, but the carnival had changed. The night was darker, the air heavier, and the rides moved in slow, jerky motions. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending as though they were alive. He wasn't alone. He never had been. From somewhere behind him, a low, mechanical voice crackled from a speaker overhead. You can't run from your past, Mark. The carnival knows what you've done, and it won't let you leave until you face the truth. Mark spun around, his mind breaking apart at the seams. It was the carnival. It had always been the carnival, and it knew everything. Chapter 5. Ghosts of the Past. The air around Mark was thick with shadows as he stumbled away from the ring-toss booth, his mind spinning. Carnival had shifted again, darker, heavier, as if it were closing in on him. Every step he took, The ground seemed to creak beneath him, like the whole place was groaning with anticipation. He wasn't sure how long he had been wandering, but his breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with a growing sense of dread. The distorted figures in the crowd, faceless, jerky, were multiplying, their eyes tracking his every move. He needed to find out what was happening. He needed answers. His feet carried him toward the old lost and found booth, a ramshackle, forgotten corner of the carnival where trinkets and faded souvenirs lay abandoned, collecting dust. A rusted sign above the booth read "Lost and Found," though nothing about it looked like it had ever been organized. Mark hesitated at the entrance. Something about this place felt wrong. He pushed the door open anyway, and the hinges groaned in protest. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The shelves were lined with forgotten items, torn carnival tickets, cracked popcorn buckets, old lollipops long since turned to dust. But it was a dusty old scrapbook sitting on the counter that caught his eye. He picked it up, its leather cover cracked and faded. His fingers trembled as he flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with smiling faces, children with cotton candy in their hands, parents with wide, laughing eyes. But as he turned the pages, the smiles grew more strained, the photos darker, the eyes more hollow. And then, toward the end, there was a picture that stopped his heart. It was a photo of him and Tommy. The two of them stood in front of the Ferris wheel smiling, carefree, just as they had been that summer. But Tommy's eyes, they were different. Mark could see it clearly. Now Tommy's eyes weren't just looking at the camera. They were staring at something in the distance, as though he already knew what was coming. The smile on his face was twisted, almost too knowing, too cold. Mark's hands shook as he turned the page, but the next picture made him freeze. There was Tommy again this time, standing in front of the Ferris wheel, but his face was pale. His body seemed to shimmer, like he was no longer fully there, no longer human. Mark blinked. And then, out of nowhere, a voice broke the silence. "Mark." He spun around, his heart in his throat. Standing before him was Tommy. Or rather, what was left of Tommy. The boy's once bright eyes were clouded with anger, his mouth twisted into a snarl. "You left me," the ghost whispered, voice crackling like dry leaves. "You left me to die." Mark's chest tightened. "Tommy?" The ghost's form flickered like a dying light bulb. "You let them take me." Mark backed away, his mind unraveling. The carnival had brought him here, but it had brought Tommy back too twisted, angry. And now, the truth was beginning to surface. Tommy's death hadn't been an accident. This place, this carnival, was far more sinister than Mark had ever imagined. The guilt, the trauma, it was feeding the carnival's power. And it wasn't done yet. Neither was Tommy. Chapter 6. The Fun House of Horrors. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he stumbled away from Tommy's ghost, the words echoing in his head like a mantra. "You left me. You let them take me." His body felt heavy, weighed down by guilt, the air around him pressing in like a physical force. He was suffocating. He turned instinctively toward the old funhouse, its towering silhouette looming in the distance, its warped mirrors reflecting jagged fragments of the night. It was impossible to miss the heart of the carnival's dark power, the place where everything seemed to converge. Mark had always hated the funhouse. As a child, it had been the place where his nightmares came alive, where the mirrors twisted his face into grotesque shapes, and the laughter of unseen spectators echoed in his ears. Now, the carnival seemed to be guiding him there. He approached the entrance cautiously, the glass door creaking as he stepped inside. The air inside was thick and warm, almost suffocating. The mirrors stretched before him like an endless maze of reflections, each one slightly distorted, a perfect replica of the carnival's eerie, decaying world. Mark hesitated, his heart racing. He felt an overwhelming sense of disorientation. He stepped toward the first mirror and blinked. The reflection staring back at him was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark, as though he hadn't slept in years. But as he took another step, the reflection shifted. Now, he saw himself bloody, bruised, and broken. His hands trembled as he reached out, only to watch in horror as his reflection grinned back at him, a twisted, monstrous version of himself, its features warped by malice. Each step he took brought a new, nightmarish version of himself. One with a grotesquely swollen face, a mirror image of pain and anguish. Another version was naked, skin crawling with sores, its eyes wild and feral. And then, in one reflection, he saw himself standing in front of the Ferris wheel with Tommy, just like in the photo, but this time, his reflection wasn't smiling. It was accusing. "Look what you've done," the reflection whispered, its voice echoing around the mirror maze. His breath caught in his throat as the memories started to come back sharp, painful flashes that cut through the fog in his mind. That day, the day Tommy disappeared, they had been at the carnival, just the two of them. Mark had dared Tommy to get on the Ferris wheel alone, the one ride you're not supposed to go on without a partner. Mark had been jealous, angry that Tommy was always braver, always better at everything. The argument, the dare, Tommy's scared face as he climbed aboard, alone, and then nothing. Tommy never came out. Mark's chest tightened, his hands shaking as he stumbled backward, the truth crushing him. He couldn't run from it. He never could. The funhouse seemed to close in on him. The mirrors now filled with distorted, laughing faces, figures that looked like Tommy, like his parents, like the people from his past. The carnival's power wrapped around him like a cold, unforgiving hand. "You can't leave," a voice whispered from the shadows. "Not until you face what you've done." Mark looked up, and the mirrors distorted again, revealing the truth that had haunted him all these years. The carnival was never truly abandoned. It had been waiting for him to return and pay the price. Chapter 7. Escape or Surrender. Mark's heart pounded like a drum, each beat crashing against his ribs as the mirrors of the funhouse warped and twisted around him. He had seen the truth, the horrible truth. His guilt hung over him like a shroud, suffocating him, but it wasn't just guilt that clung to him. The carnival itself was closing in. His breath was shallow, uneven, and the scent of rot and decay was thick in the air, like old, wet wood and something far worse. The distant clanking of metal echoed from behind him. The Ferris wheel creaked to life, its rusted gears groaning, the lights flickering, casting eerie shadows over the funhouse. The distorted faces in the mirrors grinned wider, their eyes hollow and dark. He could hear the laughter again, the same twisted laughter that had haunted his dreams. Mark turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the dark, but as he reached the exit, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing him inside. The carnival was alive. Every ride, every attraction seemed to have come to life, moving with a will of its own. The bumper cars spun wildly in their cages, smashing into each other in a chaotic frenzy. The carousel spun in endless circles, the horses' faces twisted in grotesque smiles, their eyes following him. He ran, his feet slipping on the damp floor, but the carnival wasn't done with him. He bolted past the game booths, but the figures, those twisted, distorted carnival-goers were there, emerging from the shadows, their bodies jerking unnaturally as they moved toward him. Their faces were blurred, their eyes empty, and they whispered his name, calling him back to where it all began. Mark knew, deep down, that they were no longer human. They were part of the carnival now, just like Tommy. The Ferris wheel screeched as it spun faster, the lights blurring into a sickening whirl of colors. Mark's pulse quickened, his mind breaking apart. He was trapped. Every way he turned, the carnival warped and shifted, pulling him back, making escape impossible. "Mark," a voice hissed, sending chills down his spine. It was Tommy's voice. Mark stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly, his eyes searching the darkness for the source of the voice. And then he saw him, Tommy's ghost, standing in the center of the twisted crowd of carnival figures. The boy's form flickered, his eyes burning with anger, his mouth twisted into a silent snarl. "You can't run, Mark," Tommy's voice came again, this time louder, colder. "You never could. You left me." Mark's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but the words stuck in his throat. He could feel the carnival pressing in on him, suffocating him. "Forgive me, Tommy," Mark gasped, his voice breaking. Tommy's ghost didn't respond, but he took a step closer. Mark's vision blurred, the reality around him twisting. He could feel the carnival's hold tightening, its cruel grip drawing him deeper into its endless nightmare. Mark's pulse throbbed in his ears. Carnival was offering him a choice: escape or surrender. But escape would only come with one price: facing the truth of what he had done. And even if he surrendered, he knew there would be no peace. Either way, he was trapped. He reached for Tommy's ghost, but his hands passed through the translucent figure, cold as ice. "Please," Mark whispered, "I'm sorry." But Tommy's face remained unmoving, a silent reminder of the price Mark had yet to pay. And the carnival's laughter echoed, long and low, as if it were mocking him. Chapter 8. The Abandoned Carnival. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision a blur as the carnival's twisted reality collapsed around him. He had no more strength left to run, no more will to fight. The walls of the funhouse closed in, the mirrors distorting every step he took, until it felt as if the carnival itself had become a maze designed to drive him insane. The ghostly carnival goers still lurked in the shadows, their hollow eyes following him, waiting. Then there was Tommy standing in the center of it all, a broken reflection of the boy Mark had known. His figure flickered like a dying light, his face twisted with anger and sorrow. Mark could barely recognize the boy he had once been. "You've done it now," Tommy's voice cracked, a mix of pain and rage. "You never meant to hurt me, but you did." Mark staggered forward, his legs trembling. His eyes were bloodshot, his body shaking, but the guilt was sharper than any pain. He opened his mouth, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to, Tommy. I swear I didn't. I was jealous. I was a coward." Tommy's form shimmered, as if he were growing weaker, or perhaps stronger. Mark couldn't tell. The air around them was thick with the smell of decay, the carnival rides groaning and rattling as if they were eager to see Mark suffer. "I never meant to hurt you, but I did. I dared you to go on that ride, and you never came back." Mark's voice cracked as tears welled up in his eyes. "I thought I could escape it. I thought I could forget, but it won't let me forget. The carnival, it's holding me here. It's holding us all here." Tommy's eyes, hollow, deep, seemed to soften for a brief moment, but then, just as quickly, the rage returned. "You think you can just apologize and walk away?" Carnival's twisted laughter echoed around them, as if mocking Mark's plea. Mark dropped to his knees, his hands clutching the dirt beneath him. "Please, Tommy, forgive me. I can't do this anymore. I need to be free. I need to live." The ground beneath him trembled, the carnival's monstrous grip closing tighter, pulling him deeper into its madness. He looked around, The distorted mirrors showing him broken versions of himself, guilt-ridden, twisted, haunted. It was no longer just Tommy's ghost that followed him. It was the reflection of everything he had been running from for years. In the silence, the carnival seemed to pause, waiting, as if giving Mark one final chance. And then, as if in answer, Tommy's ghost stepped toward him, his face, now calm, an ambiguous look in his eyes. But before Mark could stand, the carnival's grip tightened again. He stumbled to his feet, finally breaking free of the funhouse's grip, stepping out into the cold night air. The carnival gates loomed ahead, their rusty iron bars now creaking open. The world outside felt strangely quiet, as if the madness had never happened. He looked back. The carnival had come to life. Lights flickered, the carousel turned, and the music, that damn carnival music, played once again, haunting the night air. Mark's heart sank as he turned toward his car. He pulled the invitation from his pocket, still crumpled, still there. He got into the car, staring at the rearview mirror. The carnival loomed behind him, shadows stretching over its abandoned, decaying grounds. And the music, eerie, sickening, crackled through the radio. Mark drove away, the weight of the unresolved still hanging over him. But the carnival remained, waiting, still alive, still feeding.